Hello again. So I may have mentioned before, I've relocated recently to a new state, several hundred miles away from where I used to live. Therefore, I'm on the market for a new gaming group. And frankly, I was in the market for a new gaming group anyway, because my last one had all kind of fallen apart a couple years or so earlier. I have two leads. One of them is with a guy. I saw that he had posted on Reddit that he was looking for a group. He's in the same town I live in. Went and met him in a game store, and his friend, he also has a fiance who's interested in playing. There may be some potential there. I don't think that they're really into the exact same things that I am into in gaming, so it doesn't mean that I can't have fun with them, but I don't think I want to, break out my setting or my rules for them, because I don't think that's really what they're looking for. I think they're looking for really pretty standard stuff. I also, and I did this on purpose, I went to a church potluck dinner earlier, just today in fact, and I wore a D&D shirt, a t-shirt that I got from Amazon. It's got the old Larry Elmore basic cover art on it, and it says Dungeons & Dragons basic set. I kind of figured that if I wore that, then somebody at least who's interested in the hobby would approach me and talk about it. And sure enough, within just a minute or two of walking in, I had somebody walk up to me and talk to me about it. And apparently there's quite a few guys in my congregation that play, and they play together already. In fact, there's enough of them that unfortunately the group is already kind of on the verge of being a little bit too big. So I'm probably not going to slip in right away, but at some point either the group will kind of split or something will happen, and I'll be able to play with them, I'm sure. I don't know what kind of things they're interested in playing either. It sounds like right now they're mostly playing 5e. So, I've had little interest in 5e in general. I don't really own it. I've kind of read through the SRD, so I'm kind of familiar with it, but I don't. A lot of the stuff that they're doing in the recent supplemental stuff is just terrible. I'm not very interested in what they're doing, and there's a lot of things about that game that I already don't like. So I thought, but there's a lot of things that I do as well. I thought maybe it'd be nice to do a quick video where I kind of just spell out for myself, what is it that I'm looking for? What kind of game do I like? So first off, I would say that my number one genre is fantasy, and I do like systems that have at least some resemblance to D&D, just because it's very familiar. I've been playing it since the 80s, since the early 80s, in fact. I don't really care very much about rules, I have found. So I'm not very interested in other systems for their own sake. I kind of just want something that's familiar and the rules are easy enough or familiar enough or both that they kind of fade into the background and you don't think about them. What I also don't really like is tactical combat, at least not my RPGs, although I don't think you'll really like them that much anyway, because it's not like I play skirmish combat games or anything like that either. What I like is cinematic or descriptive combat, like you would read in a novel or see in a movie, perhaps. And I think that's much more narrative. I don't like miniatures. I don't like grids. I don't like having to stop and think about tactics and dragging the turns out while people decide exactly what to do and how to maneuver their spells so they do the maximum effect and all that kind of stuff. Frankly, it kind of bores me, and I think it also just isn't. Not only is it not fun, but it's not very realistic. And in an actual combat situation, you don't have time to play chess with your little toys. And so I don't have much interest in that. Unfortunately, many editions of D&D, especially recenter editions, and by recenter I mean since 2000, so 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, do focus a fair bit. This was especially true of 4th edition and 3rd edition. I think 5e's maybe a little less so, but not enough for me. They all kind of focus more on tactical combat and positioning and templates and distance and line of sight, and all these other kind of things that come from war games, basically. And I don't have any interest in that. That aspect of the game is no fun to me. I find that it also bogs the game down so much. And I've had combat sessions, and granted this was 3.5 at relatively high level where it's complicated, but we've had sessions that, combat just took the whole session, and we'd be together for 4 or 5 hours at a time and have essentially one combat that took up the whole session. I don't ever want to do that again. In fact, I got really kind of burned out and realized that was when I really kind of realized, and I already knew this, but I really realized that at this point that I just don't have any interest in that. What I want is for combat to be fast. I want it to be descriptive and narrative. I want it to feel more like reading a fight scene in a book, or maybe watching a fight scene in a movie or TV show or something like that, except you're doing it collaboratively with joint kind of narrative responsibility facilitated with dice, if that makes any sense. So I think that's what and that also kind of leads into what I really like best about role-playing, which is actually the role-playing. I like taking on a role and coming up with interesting scenarios and stories for these characters, kind of like, I don't know, I had the idea that playing games is kind of like Lord of the Rings meets Whose Line Is It Anyway, except that you're not necessarily trying to be funny, but you are trying to be entertaining. You're making stuff up on the spot and trying to be entertaining, but the way that you do that is you take on a role and you think, all right, so I'm running this character, I'm writing this character as an author in a way, except I'm doing it in real time, it's improvisational, and I have to do it quick, I can't stop and think about it, I don't have first drafts, whatever I do. So it's a little bit like improv acting and writing a book and something else all at the same time, I suppose. And that's what I enjoy most about gaming. I enjoy kind of the collaborative, authorial improvisation. And so, to me, I want games that focus on interesting settings, that have interesting characters, that interact with each other and with the setting in interesting ways. And that has little to do with combat. Now, combat's fun, and I think that D&D, or any role-playing game that I would play for that matter, has to be based on the kind of an action movie, a swashbuckling action movie. There's got to be combat, there's got to be action, otherwise I don't want to role-play the Duchess's Tea Party. I don't want to role-play talking heads sitting around talking politics. I want to do some of that, but I don't want that to be the focus of the game. There's got to be action. There's got to be swashbuckling action. In fact, over-the-top cinematic sometimes. Or I don't think it's very fun. But I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time because the mechanics are slow and complex on those things. So what I like is rules-light games that move fairly quickly, that kind of maybe focus more on GM rulings rather than on highly codified rule sets that try to take the GM out of the equation and do all his work for you. I don't like really over-the-top fantasy, by which I mean D&D 5e has kind of developed a reputation, and I don't even know if it's necessarily justified or not, but certainly it's true that it has the reputation that it's a little crazy. You've got all kinds of crazy races. You've got bird people, you've got turtle people, you've got cat people, you've got 15 different kinds of elves, you got people who can fly as a native racial ability, you got almost everybody can see in the dark. It's worse than the cantina in Star Wars, which is what it's often compared to, but it's actually even worse. On top of that, all of the classes, well, I don't want to say all of them, most of the classes have all kinds of little super moves and magical moves. Everybody kind of feels like they're superheroes, and the vibe of the game is now this really weird, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and I don't even mean in just a human sense, but in just a much more exotic and bizarre sense. It's a mixed up Avengers superhero game set in a setting that vaguely looks like medieval Europe, but only very, very vaguely. I actually prefer a more grounded game that looks more like medieval Europe and focuses more on humans and human-like races and has relatively little magic. And the magic that it does have is never routine or convenient. It's always kind of edgy and scary. If D&D 5th edition as written is kind of the fantasy Avengers, I want fantasy The X-Files, fantasy Christian Bale's Batman, fantasy Chris Cox's Daredevil, fantasy the Supernatural TV show, except in a fantasy setting. Stuff like that. I want it to be darker. I want it to be more mysterious. I want it to be a little edgier. I want it to be more grounded. It's not exactly sword and sorcery. A lot of people say sword and sorcery is like that. In some ways it is, but sword and sorcery is also a genre of its time, and it was created almost 100 years ago now. And in many ways, it kind of ended as a genre more than 50 years ago. And kind of some of the same types of tropes and the same types of themes and the same tone have carried over into newer subgenres like dark fantasy. But those are also different. So sword and sorcery, for example, was characterized by these punchy short stories that weren't connected. And that's not really what we want. And I definitely want more of an overtly, almost horror tone. Like you're going up against monsters, and they're really monstrous. They're kind of scary if you're going to face them. But that's exactly what the PCs do, because you're not just Joe Blow in the setting who maybe doesn't even believe in the existence of monsters because they're not everyday occurrences in this type of setting. But you're Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, so whatever monsters that there are, and there are more than most people think, you're specifically going to be seeking them out and trying to stop them and figure out how to stop them and how to thwart them and how to protect the normal people who don't necessarily believe in them or recognize exactly what it is you're doing. I really like that vibe. That's what I really want most from the game. So how else does that make it differ from 5e? Well, clearly 5e with superheroes who are practically invincible and who are designed specifically to win D&D and to win it relatively easily. I'm not super interested in that. I want characters who are maybe a little bit more vulnerable, maybe a little bit more fragile, who have to be more cautious and careful, who are kind of in over their heads, but if they're clever and lucky and a little bit smart, and most importantly, if they're cautious, they can overcome whatever challenges that I'm going to throw at them. And I do not expect that PCs are dying frequently in any game that I would run, but I do expect that the players are aware of the risk of their PC dying and they're careful because of it. Rather than in 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, I don't think that there was enough risk of characters dying. Every group I ever gamed with, we just kind of shouted huzzah and jumped into combat, and we won 99% of all of our combats without ever losing anybody. I'm not sure that I can remember in a 3rd edition game that I ever had a character out and out die in combat. Now, we did have characters that we retired for one reason or another. In fact, I retired one and replaced him with somebody else, but my other character didn't die. I just realized he wasn't really working, and so I got somebody else. And part of that was because of the focus on combat, and my character just was kind of designed for other things which didn't come up. So I've kind of, again, what I want you to do, if you want to know what kind of game I like, is go read some older, slightly darker fantasy stories, read some spy thrillers, maybe read some ghost stories or gothic horror, and kind of blend all that. Maybe even read some westerns or watch some on TV. Blend all that together and put it in a kind of a fantasy-like setting, but the influences in plot and tone and mood come from all of those other things rather than from high fantasy. And frankly, in high fantasy, as it's written as a literature, is not very much like D&D either. It is not fantasy superheroes. There's no such thing in high fantasy. D&D has kind of become the Marvel Cinematic Universe of fantasy. To me, that's fine, but it's not what I'm really looking for. So anyway, as I'm kind of searching for a new group here and trying to figure out what I will play, who I will play it with, if I'm going to run or not, what I will run, etc., etc. Those are kind of my ideals, if you will. What type of system do I want to use? Like I said, rules light. I actually don't really care that much for system. As I said before, I don't really care that much for rules. Ideally, I've had enough house rules that I've, played around with over the years that I've basically started from scratch and wrote an entire game system because the house rule document was too cumbersome to add it to any existing game system. So I was like, well, I can just write the whole thing, make it self-contained. It's less than 50 pages, easy. That's without much art, though. I'd actually like to add some AI art to my game, so I'll probably do that eventually. But that's kind of what I would prefer to do. So what game system would I want to use? I actually don't really care. Ideally, like I said, I'd use my own, but if you were just kind of looking for, well, what does that look like? There's a bunch of games that I think are interchangeable enough. I would have to house rule all of these to get them to do exactly what I want, but I wouldn't have to house rule them too much. I could do almost any of the rules light OSRs, Sword and Wizardry, Basic Fantasy, Labyrinth Lord, not the ones that clone Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I don't think, but I could take any of the others and I could run with them. That wouldn't be my ideal, but I could do that, like I said, with a couple of house rules so they work a little better. In addition, I obviously could do that with the actual older editions of D&D that the retro clones are cloning, but I think the retro clones are in some ways superior to the versions of D&D that they're trying to emulate. There's also some newer games that I think fit the bill quite well. I think that Microlight 20 is where I kind of really started on my journey of house ruling. My game has evolved so much that it's not Microlight, but it actually started out as a Microlight house rule. And when I eventually said I don't understand the conceit of having only 3 ability scores, and I added back in the other 3, and I have the basic 6 that D&D has, it just doesn't feel anything like Microlight anymore. And I had changed a lot of other things as well by that point. So that would work. 5 Torches Deep would work. Knave 2nd edition would work. Shadow Dark would work. I mean, there's tons of other games that you could use that would all give you more or less the same experience. But that's what I would prefer to run. And the good thing about all of those games is if you're not familiar with them, they're easy to pick up. I could, in fact, run those games with players who don't know how to play. In fact, I've done so, who don't even know how to play, and it's easy. And as long as they focus on, think about your character, not as a mechanical construct, but as an actual character. And when stuff comes up, just think about what you would do. Don't look at your character sheet and say, oh, I have this special move right here that's ideal for that. Don't think like that. Just think, well, if I were actually this character and I were in this situation, what would I do? And say that, and then I can interpret how the rules apply there. So that's kind of how I prefer to run. That's the type of game I prefer to run. I'm flexible enough I could do other things as well, but that would be my ideal. That would be my perfect game. Anyway, this is getting a little rambly. I'll go ahead and quit now. Talk to you guys later.